this just which is going to be our ID, and this is going to be the primary key for this class. Now it's important that you define some default getters and setters. These. We're going to be doing a code-first approach. We're taking a code-first approach to building this application, which means we're going to define our models, our classes, and how they relate to each other in our code, and then the entity framework, which is part of ASP.NET, will build the databases from looking at our code. So it will look at our code, look at these relationships, and build databases. But for that to work, we need to set all of these parameters to public, and we need to make sure they have getters and setters. Okay, next one, public, and let's have our string. So this will be like what your to-do item actually is. So get and set. That one is done. So we want whether or not done or not. Sorry if my typing is. Rubbish, but my microphone is like huge. So this is our basic like bread and butter for what we need. Actual like the actual item, that's all we need, is just 3, but we also need a reference to the user. So we have a public virtual and it's application user, and we'll call it user. So, what this is, application user is the class that defines a user in this framework. We'll go into that in a bit more detail later on, but we need to know that's what it is. That's how we're going to link this to-do item to a particular user. So that's our to-do class done. So we can save this, and I'm actually also going to build the solution. Because if we start doing things like we need to build the solution before the entity framework is going to be able to work to build our databases. So we've got these references to all this and so the next thing to do, database class done, so we item to a particular user. So that's our to-do class done, so we can save this, and I'm actually also going to build the solution. Because if we start doing things like we need to build the solution before the entity framework is going to be able to work to build our databases. So we've got the references. So the next thing to do is we need to define, we need to tell the framework part of a database. And to do that, we need to define a collection of these items and tell it what database to put it in. There are a few ways you could do this, but I'm just going to show you one of the ways. So if we go to the identity models, this was a model that was created when we created the project and we told it that we wanted user authentication. It created the models, views and controllers to deal with users, and this identity models is exactly what it sounds like. Is this application DB context, which is referring to our data access layer, which I think I mentioned last time. Is if we have some kind of DB context, you've got to immediately think this is defining a database. And so in this database, the application DB context, it's inheriting our identity DB context for application user. So this database is going to have our users. It's going to be a database of users, and with all the various things that we have set for them. So what I want to do is I want to add. There's going to be a bunch of tables in here which are defined by whatever's needed for our users in the identity system. So we want to add a table for to-dos. And so the way that we do that is relatively easy. So we add a public DB set, and it's going to be a set of to-do. I'm going to call it to-dos, and we're going to give it the getters. Setters. Okay, so what this will do is that this class DB set is part of this data access layer. So this is going to be a collection of to-dos that are in a table in this database that's defined by application DB context. Now we could have, if we wanted to, created a new database and put this table in that. But what you find is by putting these together, putting this table in with the users table and information is going to make things easy for us when we start doing things like migration and when we think about deployment, because all these things are going to be in the same database. And in fact, what happens is this here. So the constructor of this application context has got this thing here, and this is telling us what connection or where this database is. So if you had your own database, you put an address for it in here. But at the moment we use default connection. And then if there isn't a database already, the entity framework is going to create one that works by looking through all these classes, looking at relationships between them. And it's pretty clever actually, particularly with the users, as we'll see in a minute. So we've defined our models. There's something I want to enable before we go into making controllers and forms. Something that's quite a good feature of this is there's a really nice migration system which is going to help you a lot with your databases. Now it's not enabled by default, so what you have to do is you open up the package manager console, which is called NuGet. NuGet again is really, really good. For installing like add-ons, for instance, maybe you want to install Ajax or a newer version of jQuery. That can all be done through this package manager console. If that isn't open, then there's somewhere up here that you so NuGet Power Package Manager, so tools. NuGet, and you can bring up the console. Now what we're going to do is we're going to write enable -migrations, and you can tab to autocomplete. And what this is going to do is it's going to look at what databases are in our application. So it's only going to find the one that was in identity models, this one, and it's going to make a bunch of classes. If we go, it's added this folder migrations, and we have this configuration class. And what this allows us to do is we can actually start seeding our database when we create it. So when we're testing, we don't want to have to launch our application and create new users every time we test. What we'll be able to do is actually seed some users in here and do it that way. So what actually I might do is I might do that right now. So let's do that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a function to our configuration class to add users. So void add users, and that's going to take in the application. It's going to basically take in the same input. So if you see here, we've got this is taking in a data context, which is this. So we're just going to do the same. So here we want to add some users. So let's add new users. So user equals new application. Oh, right, okay, I forgot to do something. So what we will need to do is we need to actually import the right namespace. So we're going to be using asp.net.identity. And using Microsoft.asp.net.identity.entity framework. So we want a new user. So we're going to create var user equals new application. Let's try again, see if it turns up. Don't know why it's not turning up here. What does this say? Working. So let's try and see what happens if maybe this hasn't updated yet. So like it might have not figured out that I've added these yet. Let's try just doing this. So username equals So one thing is that usernames and email addresses tend to be the same in this system. So this is, we haven't, okay, right. So what we haven't got is a reference to our models here. Using to-do list dot models. Right, okay, cool, that's working now. So our application user is defined here. So our application user is defined here. So it's in our namespace to do list.models, and we hadn't imported that here. Sorry about that. So we've got our user is new application user, which this is the class that defines our users. Remember, it's the same thing, the application user here. And then we can use the user manager. New user manager application user, and then new user store. and this is going to be in our context, from our context. Okay. Now, if you're wondering where this is all coming from, don't worry, I will show you in a minute. Create. And then we're going to create the user with a password. Okay, so this set. Code will create a user, put it in our data context using a user manager with a password. So where you could get this from is if we go to controllers, we have account controller here, which was made default by the system, and this is what makes all of the registration stuff work. And you can see a similar kind of, if we have the register method here, it's the same kind of thing. So we're adding a new application user. In this case, the email is coming from a form, but that's where you would have, if you were trying to figure this out yourself, that's where you'd figure it out. You could look, this stuff is already in there for you to see. Right, okay, so I've added this seeding function. I need to actually put it in my seed method. So add users. Nope. Add users context. Okay, so this seed method is called whenever we create a database. Whenever the entity framework creates a new database, and so it will seed it with these users in. And what I can do to actually run this is I can add a migration first. Add migration. I'm going to call it to do 1. And this is like for what we're doing here, we're not going to use this migration system to its full potential. But if you were developing an application, you kept changing databases. Then this would be very useful. And what it does is it generates a basically like a class or a function that defines this migration. It looks at what the database was set up previously and what it's set up now, and it adds everything you need to do. So here it's creating tables. So all of these ASP.NET roles and ASP.NET user roles, these are to do with the identity stuff, so we don't worry too much about those. But here you've got create table to-dos, and it's creating a new table with an int, so ID, description, is done, and user ID. So it's using all of these things here to make our new table. It's automatically figured out that ID is our primary key and has set that as such, and it's also figured out the foreign key is the users, then because it knows there's a table of users already, and it's looked down and seen that in this user object there is a user ID, and it's using that as the foreign key in this table ASP.NET users. So where's that? Is down here. So this ASP.NET users is a table of these user objects, and it knows it's seen this relationship and it's created it. And then to create the database, we just type update database. And then it will actually run these SQL statements. It will create these tables, and there we have it. So what we've done now is we've created our model and we've linked it to our users. And in the next video, we're going to build a controller that will allow us to edit to-do lists and to view them. So as always, if you've got any questions, put them in the comments, or get hold of me on Twitter at Dr. Sean Walton. Thanks. So in the last video, we created our model, and we linked that to our user, this application user object. We also enabled migrations for databases, and we actually created the database using a code first kind of approach. So what we're going to do now, and hopefully this will make things a bit clearer. I realized the last video probably felt a bit like jumping in the deep end, but it's one of these things, like I was saying, it's hard to teach, to pick where to start with this framework. So we've got our model. That was the main thing, is we've defined this model, and we've set up a seeding function here, so that when the entity framework creates a database, it seeds it with an example user. So what we're going to do now is create our first controller. So the way we do that is we just right click on controllers, and then we want add, and we click controller. What we want to do, we have a bunch of choices here. We could just write an empty controller, which would give us literally what it sounds like. It would be completely empty, and we'd have to write everything ourselves. We could do a controller that has read-write actions but no way of viewing them. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a controller with views using an entity framework data context. Now this data context is going to be our application DB context, which we have been using before, that we added the table of to-dos to. Okay, so I'm going to click add. Now the model that we're interested in editing is to-do. Okay, so to-do, and the data context we want is our application DB context. So we're editing the model to do, which is this thing here, and we want it to point to this database, so DB context. And then I wanted to generate the views. Reference script libraries is going to be referencing things like jQuery, which we want that to do. Using a layout page, we're going to just use the default layout page. We'll probably talk about that a bit later in a future video. And the controller name, it's already made for us. So it's called it to-dos controller. So it's pluralized the name of our class and added the word controller to it. So if I click add, it's going to start scaffolding. And what scaffolding is, it's creating all the controller and all the views to do what we just asked it to. So let's have a look at the controller first. So the controller, to-dos controller, that's been created, has a number of, well, let's go through line by line. So it's a public class called to-dos controller, and it extends the base class controller, which is something that is part of MVC. The first thing you see here is we've got an application DB context called DB, which is a new application DB context. Now that comes from here. So we defined application DB context, and we defined all these tables that go into that. So this is our data context, our data access layer here, which we're defining. And then we're going to be using this in the various methods to view things in the database and to add things to the database, to get things out and to do queries. So we first got index, which returns a view of DB to-dos to list. So it's going to list all of the to-dos and return that as a view. We've got details. In fact, actually, do you know what? I'm going to run this and show you it running to explain this to you a bit better. So what it's also created, I'm just going to show you, is it's created a folder of to-dos in views, and it's got a file for each one of these methods. So edit, there's like an edit one, create, there's a create one. So let's run this. So at the moment this hasn't changed from what the default was earlier. But if I now do this, if I navigate to to-dos, because that's the name of our controller, then we get this. So in way MVC works is that, unlike some web frameworks where what you type here, let's look at what the URL is. The URL is a host name and port followed by some kind of path, and usually you're probably used to this path pointing to a specific file. So maybe it's a different. I'm trying to think of an example. I don't think I can find an exact example, but you can imagine you've got a bunch of HTML files on your web server, and you'd expect maybe this is index, maybe it's gallery, maybe it's guestbook or something, and that's pointing to a specific file. Now, the framework that we're using doesn't do that. What it does is it looks at this path, and then a routing system looks at a route table and matches that path to something in the route table that corresponds to a call. It actually doesn't cause a function. It instantiates a controller and calls an action to that controller. So in this case, we've typed to-dos. It's created a to-do controller. And it's called the index method to that controller. And what that's done is it's returned a view, and it's given that an argument db.todos.tolist. Okay, so that's what's happened. Is we've gone to .todos, and it's instantiated a to-do controller, and it's called that method, that action method of that class. Now, if we wrote details. In fact, let's not do details because that's probably going to... details isn't going to work because we haven't got anything in there. But if I do create, what we've got is this is now gone called the create method. Method. We've got a form here, and we can write in, let's say, to do 1, and I can click create, and you can see we've gone back. That's redirected us back to this to-do index, and now there's a list. I've got to do 1 is done, and I can click on these links. I can get details, and that takes me, now the details is working. We've got to-dos / details / 1. And what that's doing is it's calling this method with an argument of 1, because that's what, here you can see you've got the 1. And so that's what the scaffolding has done, is it's set up a system that allows this all to work. And let's have a quick look. So I'm going to stop this. And let's have a look at our create view. So what we've got in our create view is this is what we were seeing on the page before, is that we've got a HTML form. So this, I'm not going to go, I can't go into, is this is what we were seeing on the page before, is that we've got a HTML form. So this, I'm not going to go, I can't go into details of the Razor language or details of Razor in this tutorial video. I'm going to assume that you know a little bit. So this is, we've got at the top, we're importing the model that we're using is our to-do here. We're using a HTML helper, begin form, and then there's a form being made that's got things like labels for our model description. So it's the label for this and the editor for this. Okay, and then this is a form that will create a new to-do item. Okay, so at the moment, I can create these. When I created this, it didn't automatically. So we can go to the create method and see what's going on. So what we've got here is our create method is taking a to-do as its argument. And it's adding, if the model is valid, it's adding that to-do to our DB context. So db.todos, to-dos is the table. So if we remember in our identity model, we define to-dos in our application DB context. So that's the table. And then we're using .add, which is a method that adds this to the database. Then save it. We're saving the changes, db.save changes, and then redirecting to the index. Okay, and let's show you that again. Now, what's quite cool is if you have like a view selected and you click run, it will take you straight to that view. So I can create item 2. I click create, and it redirects me to the index. Okay, and I can see what's there. So I'm going to exit that, and then stop. So how is that working? So what's happening is that this form, so we've got a HTML helper there that's starting a form, and it's taking those inputs and putting it into a model, which is our model, which is defined here, the to-do list.models.todo, and then it's sending that as a post request to this controller, and this controller is taking that as an input and to this do, and then it's sending that as a post request to this controller, and this controller is taking that as an input and it's putting that into this add. And what's quite nice about this framework is that using something called model binding is we're not having to figure out ourselves how to take these form inputs and relate it back to this model, like to create a class and say, right, whatever was in this particular input box, that's the description. So to-do.description equals this string. It's doing that all for us using model binding. And so we can just take an input as this to-do type. And then it's saying, well, if that's valid, based on some validation tests, then we add it to our database. Now, what isn't happening is that there isn't any link being made between this to-do and the user that's creating it. Okay, because that is something, it's a bit more complex what's going on. It's not something that can just be automatically done by the scaffolding. So that's some logic that we need to add to this method. And the way to do that is we need to get a hold of the current user object. Who is the current user? What's their user application user object? And then we can associate that, add that to this to-do object here, and then add to the database. So the way we do that is that there's some methods to help us. So we're going to do string current user ID equals, and then what we can do is we can type user dot identity dot get user ID. And we might need to get some, we need to use Microsoft Identity for that to work. So again, we're using this namespace, Microsoft.asp.net.identity. And so user is the current user who is using your application. And then we're going into that user's identity and getting their user ID. And what that allows us to do is we can take that ID and look in our database that was defined here, our application DB context, and grab the user object and use that to put a reference here into our to-do that's being created. So we do that like this. Application user is the type of user that we're getting. So current user equals DB, remember, is our database that we define as a private field here. So DB dot users dot first. So users is a table that we first or default. I'm just gonna show you back here. So remember, this is a database. Just gonna show you back here. So remember, this is a database, and the database includes a table of users. So we're going to do a query. We want the first or default user, so X, and you do this with lambda expressions. So this is what I was saying about having this data access layer where we're not actually writing SQL queries ourselves. This is actually, we're going to write a lambda expression, and then the framework is going to write the query for us. So x.id. So we're looking for an object where the object.id is equal to the current user ID. So here X is our kind of general user, where the ID of the user in the database is equal to the current user ID. That's what we want. So we'll get, and we want the first. There should only be one. So we want the first user that has that ID. And then what we can do is we can say to-do .user. Remember, this is the model that we've got from our view. So this is the argument we've got here. Equals current user. Okay, so now we've brought this model in, This model itself only had the model in. This model itself only had the description ID and is done. It only had these things set. And then what we've done is in our controller, we've put the logic to get the current user's identity. Using that user ID, find the user object from our user database, and then associated that user object with this to-do item here. And then we put it into the database. And we return the view as normal. So let's see if this works. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run this again. Now to see if this is actually working, I'm going to have to log in. So if you remember, we seeded our database with a user that was user1@email.com with the password. So user1@email.com, and the password is password. And I'm going to log in. Okay, I'm going to click save just to make it easier for myself. So we logged in, so look, that totally worked. And then we want to-dos create. And I'm going to put user1, let's first to-do create, and that worked. Now what you'll notice here is we've gone back to the index and we've got user ones. I can see the one I've created. I can also see the ones that I didn't create, that were created by that when we weren't logged in, but we'll have a different user. We'll fix that in a moment, but I want to show you something. So when we're actually running our application, we can look in this Server Explorer and see the connections that we've got, and one of them is to our database. So I want to connect to this, just double clicking it. Let's have a look at tables. We've got our to-dos. So let's have a look at show table data. And that will load, and what we've got is, you can see these are all the things we've created. And the first two their user ID is null, because with that we hadn't written that logic. We hadn't written this logic yet. So there was no way of it knowing what the user ID was going to be. So they're set to null. Now we've also got in this database all the other tables that are to do with the identity system. So we can show the data here, and what we've got is we can see our ID. So this is the information to do with the user. Now that's not where the okay, well, there we go. So we've there's various things here with the users. So this is where all our users will be saved. I don't think that the user ID here will match the user ID in here. I think, is it the security stamp? No. So there's kind of a behind the scenes thing going on that links these, and that's why we can't straight use the user ID here to do our database search. Or we can't use that. We can't just put current user ID in here. We need to go through and get the user object, I think. Anyway, okay, so at the moment our functionality is that we can create to-do items. Well, we can add and remove items from a checklist, yeah? So I could have clicked delete and got rid of it, so I can tick this off. What we haven't got working yet is users should only see to-dos lists they have created. Because at the moment I can see these others. I know that the user associated these are null, but still that they shouldn't appear. Like the user is null, like I'm not null, right? I'm user 1. So that's going to be in our index function. So yeah, just to make sure you're following. So when we go to create, I don't want create, I want to-dos. So to-dos calls the function index. It's the default routing. So we haven't got anything. If I typed index, that would work as well. But we don't have to type index. It's like if you go to a normal website, that's like the default. You should know this. It always goes to index.html. In this case, our index then refers to this function. So what it's doing here is it's returning a view that's got a list of all the to-dos in the database. And that's why we're seeing all of them. So we need to actually tell this not to return all of them. So we need to do a query. The first thing is we need to get the user, so get the current user. So we're going to do it the same way we did before. So current user ID equals user dot identity dot get. So we get the user, so get the current user. So we're going to do it the same way we did before. So current user ID equals user dot identity dot get user ID. And we're going to do exactly the same. Application user, current user equals looking in the database DB, users dot first or default, and we've got the lambda expression. So our general object x, we want x where x.id is equal to the current user ID. Current user ID. So this will get the current user. But so then we need to add a query to this. So we can do .where same a lambda expression again. So x, where x x dot. So this x here now is a to do item. User equals current user. Okay, so now I'm going to load the index one. So we're going to look into this in a bit more detail in another video, but let's just leave that for now. So I'm going to click here, and that will launch to our whatever they're building. Errors. Oh, my bad. So I forgot to close the bracket. My bad. Whatever their build errors. Oh, my bad. So I forgot to close the bracket. So I'm going to launch that. So now, there we go. We're only seeing the to-do list that we created because we added this logic here that looked at who's the current user, and let's, instead of returning the whole list to our view, let's just return the to-dos where the user equals the current user. Okay, so what we can do is we can actually tick off users should only see to-do lists they've created. Something else we should add actually is users should only be able to edit their own to-do items. Okay. Again, sounds obvious, but we need to state that because at the moment that's not the case. Like, I could edit other items, but we're going to look into that in a future video, how to stop that. So what have we done? I know this has probably gone through quite quickly, but because it's a video, I hope you can rewind and try and follow it again at your own pace. So in the last video, we created our to-do model here, which was to-do.cs, a to-do class. And that class has an ID, which is our primary key for that class in our database table. It has a description and it has an is-done boolean. We wanted to link those to-dos with our user. And using the ASP.NET identity system, our user is an object application user. So we've put a reference there to the user. Now, because we're using a code first convention, we needed to put a table of to-dos in our data context. And we were using the application DB context, which was the default context that was created to store user information. So we added that using this DB set here. So this is our data access layer. It was adding a new table to this data context called to-dos. We enabled migration using the package manager console, and we seeded a new user in the configuration file that was created. We then added a controller, which was a to-dos controller, And that also, we told the framework to also scaffold some views. So it created create, delete, details, edit, index views for us. And all these views are associated with a method in this class. And whenever we navigate to these views, the .NET is instantiating a controller and it's calling one of these methods. The default scaffolding didn't associate these to-dos with the user. All it did was it filled in the description and is done. The ID was automatic because it's the primary key, so it was just increasing that. But it wasn't doing anything with the user. So we had to write logic in our controller to get the current user, get the current user's ID, use that ID to do a query in our database of users, which we defined in our controller here as an application DB context. That then gave us our current user, and then we could put that current user, set it to the user in this object, which came from our view, and then added that to the database. So this associated each to-do that was created with the user that created it. And that was kind of step one. Step two is that we only wanted users to be able to see the ones they created themselves. So we needed to add some more logic to the index method, where same kind of thing, we're getting the current user using the identity system, doing a database query using this lambda expression to find the user object for the current user, and then instead of returning the whole list of to-dos to the view, we only returned the to-dos where the user is equal to the current user. And that gave us, we've now got basic functionality. We can create to-dos, and every time it's created, there's a link to the current user that's put in. And then we can, when we view to-dos, we don't see all of them. We only see the ones associated with whoever is logged in. And so hopefully in those two videos, like, go through them again. If you're not quite following, watch them again. I know it's about an hour in total, but this is kind of, you know, this stuff is I would say like the basics. There's some slightly more advanced stuff with this user relationship, which isn't done automatically for you, which you need to do yourself. So that's quite important to look at, and hopefully is quite useful. So it's the first time I've done any kind of programming live on a video like this. So I'd love to get some feedback of how I'm doing this. I hope it's okay for you to follow. What would probably be useful is if you tried to write this code as I'm doing it, like pause the video and do it. If you have any questions, then ask me. Any feedback, like I said, I'd like to hear that. So I'm going to leave it here for now in this video. And then the next one, what we're going to start to do is, if we look at our aims, we said we wanted to information stored server side, we've done that, haven't we? So style should change. We're not going to do that right now. I'm going to order these a bit based on priority. And right, we've done these, we've done that, we've done that. Users should only be able to edit their own items. The page shouldn't refresh when a user adds a new item. So at the moment, adding a new item is a bit of a palaver. So, right, let's go to do. So if I want to create new, I'm at my list of to-dos. I've got to click create new. That takes me to another page, let alone just refreshing the page I'm on. I now add my other to-do, another to-do. And look, I've had to move various pages to get this done. It's not very, doesn't feel good from a user point of view, right? Whereas these to-dos, like, it's really, this is kind of cool and really good. Another to-do, right? That's so easy, and that's really good. And if we can create that functionality, I want a text box here basically that as I type in and push enter, immediately I get the feedback of I've added a new view. I've added a new to-do. I don't want this click and create new to go to another thing and that kind of stuff. So yeah, and the other thing is to like this. These aren't actually checkboxes. These are just showing if that's done. If I want to check this is done, I've got to click edit. I've got to click here, and then I've got to click save. Like, that isn't a to-do, an effective to-do list is about getting that endorphin hit of like crossing something off your list. Is a really important part of a to-do list. The other thing is that this is just like default stuff at the top. If I go to the home page, there's no way of me getting to that page without like writing in something myself. I know we didn't add that to our list of to-dos, but that is an important thing. So we're going to see how we can add that. That's probably what we'll start the next video doing. So again, I want feedback would be great. So I will do the next video probably this afternoon and post it up. So thanks for watching. I hope this is useful. Like I said, this is the first time I've done anything like this. So, take it, realize that when you're watching, and let me know how I can improve it. Thank you. So, the moment. I'm going to click on index and run from this. So this is the index in the to-do controller. So we started out by making our model of a to-do, and in that model we added a reference to the user, and then we made a controller that would allow us to create to-do items, and it also allows us to view the items. So here is the index. I'm going to log in. So I seeded the database with this user and password, and then I'm going to go to to-dos, and I can see the to-do items that this user has created. But to create a new one, I've got to click create new. I've got to type my description in here. And then I click create, and then it comes back to this original page, which is not a very nice interface. What I'm aiming for is to have some kind of text box down here that when I enter in an item, it just appears, so that it only updates this small page. The other thing that's a bit annoying is that from the home page, there's no way of navigating to the to-do list, which is something else I want to add today. So the two things we're going to try and do is we're going to just first quickly add some, or edit this nav bar at the top, and then we're going to make it so that we don't have to go to another page to enter an item on the to-do list. We're going to make it so it works with an Ajax call, that it just updates the area of the web page that needs updating. So I have a cup of tea, and I am ready to do this. So let's go. I'm going to stop this running. Right, so first let's sort out this navbar. The first question is, where is this navbar actually coming from? And we can, it's coming from the layout. So if we go into views, where is it? So we have shared, which hopefully makes sense to you that these are views that are shared among all the different views. Excuse me. So what we've got, whenever you see a view that has starts with an underscore, what that's telling you is it's not a full view on its own. And in this case, it's telling you that this is a layout. So if we open the layout, then what we have is we can see this div here. I'll tell you what, let's look at this. If you haven't used Chrome Developer Tools before, they're really useful. I'm going to open up Developer Tools. Let's move this into separate windows so it's a bit easier for you to see. So what's quite cool is that we're seeing here the HTML that has been actually rendered by the view. Remember, this file here is not a HTML file. It's a CS HTML. It's written in Razor, which is the kind of, I don't know if you call it scripting language, but it's the syntax that's used to make to draw the views, to make the views, and it allows you to mix quite nicely between HTML and C# or JavaScript. So whenever you see an @ symbol, that means you're going to your like C# syntax. So here, if we've got @viewBag, and you can see that viewBag is a type, is actually an object, and then .title is the title from the viewBag. And there's other things here like HTML is a class that has lots of helpers in, which you'll be using a lot. And we will definitely be using that a lot today. So let's find this navbar. So this is what we're seeing here is the HTML that was rendered by .NET, and then that's what our browser then itself renders, and that's what you see. So let's have a look. So it's going to be in the body. So what's quite nice, if I've clicked on elements and I can mouse over all these elements, it will highlight on the page where they are. So here we go. So div class navbar inverse navbar fixed top. So this is what we need to find and change. So I'm going to minimize that. So it's here. So we've got navbar inverse navbar fixed top. And what we've got is you can see how this is working. So we've got application name, home, contact, about, contact, and then our kind of login details here. So let's find those. So here we go. First we've got HTML link, application name. Let's change that to do application. I know that's a boring name, but hey ho. And then we have these action links here. So this is an example of a HTML helper. And a HTML helper, well, it helps you write HTML exactly like it sounds. So this method here, action link, creates a link to a controller action. So remember we said last time that when you're navigating a website that's been made with ASP.NET MVC, the path at the end of the URL doesn't point to a file. What that does is that is interpreted, and then a route table looks up which controller action to perform based on the path that you give it. It's not going to a file. It's not like a file system that it's looking at. Now those routes are mainly done via convention. So if we look at to-dos, we have, well, if we go to look at the controller first, so we have our to-dos controller has various things, details, and actually you can see it's what's written here is the path, the like conventional path that's going to get you to this action. So to get to details, to-dos, which is the controller name, and then details, which is this method, and then at the end this is an argument which is ID. The 5, there's a special, the default routing allows you to put this ID on, basically. Now if we had to manually write the path in, if we change something like the name of the controller, or we decided we wanted a custom route because the the paths or the URLs that would be generated by the convention were like ugly or really hard to use, then we'd have to keep manually updating the link in here. Instead, what the action link does is we tell it a method and a controller, and it automatically generates the HTML that will get you that controller. So I don't really want an about and a contact page, so I'm going to get rid of those. So we want HTML. We want to go to the to-do controller, and we want to go to the to-do controller index. And so this takes 3 arguments. The first one, I always get these mixed up. So let's so link text. So we start off with what we actually want the user to see for the link. My to-do list, let's say that. To-do list. Then we want the action name, which is index, because that's what we want. We want the user to go straight to there. And then the actual controller name itself. So we want that to be to-dos. Right, that should be it. So I'm going to exit that, run it, and there we go. So we've got a home button. It's change the application. I don't think I really want that home button either. We'll get rid of that in a minute. So let's see what it did. So we go here into the nav bar. So here we go. Right. So this is where we're looking. So what it's done is it's made a link that goes to /todos. And so if I'm logged in, I can click on my to-dos list. And there we go. We're at that. Stop this. I'm going to remove this home. Thing because I don't like it. We've already got the application name. You click on that and it takes you home. So why are we repeating it? I'm going to run it because I made a change. I want to make sure I didn't screw something up. Cool. Right, that's done. So that's starting to look a bit nicer. Like at some point we can get rid of this stuff. Maybe you actually want to launch straight into your to-do list. You don't want to come to this home page. That's up to you. Like this framework's pretty flexible. It's very flexible, in fact. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to think about the interface for adding a to-do. We want to recreate, as I said from the start, this interface from Trello, which is I click add an item, there's a text box, I type something in, push enter, and it updates there. I'm not going to a different page. The page isn't refreshing. It's just updating what needs to be updated. And that screams Ajax. And which is exactly what Ajax is designed to do, is that we'll have some JavaScript code that will create those. That will create. We'll just update the relevant part of your web page, not all of it. It'll do the HTTP request in the behind the scenes for you. So let's have a look where our table is built at the moment. It's going to be built in the index. So this is our index in to-dos. And we can see we've got class table. So here, between here and here is what's making the table. Now I want to take a little bit of time of looking at this. So at the top here we've got this line that says @model IEnumerable to-do list .models.todo. So what that's telling this particular view is to expect a list of to-dos, a list of these. It's then looping, well, once it has this model, this to-do model, there is a bunch of metadata associated with the to-do. And we might end up adding our own metadata to this, which you do with data annotations, which you'll be doing in here. But for now, we're not going to. And so when it says here display name for model description, we could define a display name here for description that makes more sense, and it would render that knowing that the model was a to-do. And then what it does is it says for each item in model, and it goes around, it loops around, and it builds a HTML table. And you've got this kind of display for, it's figuring out, it sees that this is a string, so it knows it's text. This one, it sees it's a Boolean, so it makes something that's relevant for a Boolean. And it's doing that for you. It's quite powerful. What we want to do is we want to be able to change this whole table with a separate function. Yeah, we want to be able to create this with a JavaScript function when it updates and put it in this space. And the way we do that is using an Ajax call. And what an Ajax call does is it will send out a request, a HTTP request, and then it gets a response, which would usually be HTML. Maybe it would be a JSON or XML. In our case, it's going to be HTML. And it will take that HTML and replace the contents of some element in your on your current page with that HTML and update it. And that's like, you can get really good, rich user interaction with that. So the first thing I'm going to do is define a div here. So I'm going to say div class. I'm going to call it ID. Equals table div. And what this is going to be is I'm going to want the table to appear here in this div. But the table I want to be defined outside of this view. And I'm going to define that in a partial view. So I'm going to right click on to-dos, add view. And I'm going to create it as a partial view. And the name, I'm going to name it, I'm going to put an underscore so I know it's a partial view, and call it to-do table. And I'm going to create it with a model. Actually, no, I'm going to create empty of that model. I'm going to do this myself. So create as a partial view, add. Okay, so View add. Okay, so I've got an empty view. Right, so I'm going to copy this out of here, save that, and into here. Save that, and into here. So this is going to, well, we haven't defined the model, so it's not going to know what it is. So we have to include this line to tell the system that that's what you should be expecting as a model. And so this is basically, I've just copied that table and put it in there. And now I need a way of actually putting or building that table. I need a function that I can run in my controller that will build this table and return it as valid HTML. Now, if we were to just call that, it would return basically some HTML just on its own. And it wouldn't have the thing that separates a view from a partial view is that when you return a view, it also includes the full layout. So you have different layouts for different views, and everything to start with uses the original one. And that's why when we navigate to the to-do controller like index, you still see the nav bar. We didn't put the nav bar isn't in this index, but if we look at, if I still got this open, let's go to shared layout. If you look, there's a line here called render body, and what that does is that's where the view ends up. So in this render body, that's where this is going to end up, is there. And so when you return a view, it expects to first build this layout and then do the view that you wanted and shove it in where it says render view. Whereas a partial view, it's just going to make the HTML and return that as it is. So we've got that. At the moment, this is going to do nothing because nothing's actually nothing's going to run. Like it's just we're going to get an empty div. So what we need to do is we need to write some JavaScript to do this for us. And to do that, we're going to be using Ajax. And so what we need to do is we need to actually import the Ajax package first. So you do that by in the package control console, install package Microsoft .jquery .unobtrusive .ajax. Hopefully I spelled that right. Yep, okay, so now Ajax will work. So what do we need? Where should we start? Let's start by making the JavaScript. So I'm going to build, for this, we've got our scripts. I'm going to put it in, I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call it custom scripts. Okay, and I'm going to put it in there so we can separate the scripts that we've made from the scripts that are part of all these packages. So I'm going to add a JavaScript file. I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call it custom scripts. Okay, and I'm going to put it in there so we can separate the scripts that we've made from the scripts that are part of all these packages. So I'm going to add a JavaScript file, and I'm going to call this. I'm going to call this build table. So there we've got our JavaScript. Now what we want at the moment is we want this build table to be called as soon as this page is finished loading. So what's going to happen, this page is going to load and there's going to be an empty div. We then want our JavaScript to call build to do table, get the HTML that's generated, and then put it in the div that's already there. If we didn't wait for the page to load, that div might not exist and it wouldn't work. And there's a easy way of doing this with jQuery, which is quite nice. If I can remember. Right, so it is the $sign is an alias for jQuery. Document dot ready, and then we're going to put a function in here, and in this function is all the stuff we want to do. I'm just going to put that in there. So what we want to do is we want to make an Ajax call, and I'm going to do this using the jQuery kind of interface, or I don't know what you call it, API, I guess, or for Ajax. So we're going to call Ajax, and then we're going to give it some arguments. So the Ajax call, the first argument we're going to give it is the URL that we want it to actually, the URL we want the Ajax call to send a request to. And that's going to be to-dos build table. Build to do table. That's what we call it. I think. To do controller, build to do table, yeah. Do you know what? I'm going to be sure. Okay, so that's the first argument. And then we want to tell it what to do on the success. And that, you're basically giving this Ajax call a function to perform from the result. So the result is going to be what the Ajax call got from the query. So from the HTTP request. So it got a response, and that's going to be in result. And then we're going to use some jQuery to change the div. So we called it table div. We're going to make the HTML result. So that should be it. So what this is doing, we're doing, when the document is loaded, we're going to do an AJAX call, or AJAX request, I guess, and to this URL, and then the result we get back, we're going to put it in table div, which is defined here. At the moment, that's not going to do anything because we're not calling this anywhere, and so we need to add a call to the script in our index view. So what we do, let's have a look. I just want to show you something else. If you look at layouts, notice there's a render section scripts required equals false. If we have any scripts we want to add, we need to add them to the scripts section. Otherwise, they'd appear before we load jQuery and Bootstrap and all these other things. And that means it wouldn't work because like jQuery needs to be loaded before we can do any jQuery. So we need to make sure we put it in the proper section. So I'm going to do section scripts. So script source equals, what's quite nice is when you do this, it gives you, you can just navigate to it. So custom scripts, build tables, close that. The other thing we want to load is we want to load, do we want to load this? Yes, we want to load the jQuery, sorry, AJAX itself. So let's do script source equals, that's going to be in scripts because that's something that we didn't make, and it's unobtrusive AJAX min. So we want the minified one. Okay, so so that's done everything. So what's going to happen is that the index is going to load. Initially, nothing's going to be there. The table div is going to be empty. Then, because we've loaded this script is going to run. It's going to check that the document is ready. It's going to do an AJAX request where it's going to send a request to this URL, and the result it gets back, it's going to put it in that table. So let's see if this works. Okay, so let's have a check. So these are all the to-dos that we've created as this user. But I want to look to convince you this is actually doing what I said. If we look at here, we can see we've got table div. So now you can see that inside we've got our table that was created from that partial view. And that's a key difference from how it was set up before. And this is what's going to enable us to have the interface where we can add items by typing and pushing enter It's only going to update that table. And in fact, we're going to end up using this function build table quite a lot for various different things when we want to update update that table dynamically. Okay, I'm going to leave this video at this point, and there's quite a lot to cover with the Ajax calls. As always, any questions, ask me, and I will get the So last time we changed our index so that there was an empty div called table div that when the page loads, a JavaScript file is run, build table.js. There's then an Ajax request is made to this URL that invokes this function, build to do table, which builds a partial view, which is our table. Then the Ajax inserts that table into the div. And that's where we got to. So this was the reason we're doing this is because we want to be able to add an item to the to-do list without going to another page, without refreshing the whole page, that kind of stuff. So that's what we're going to implement today. Before we start that, I had a thought, and I think this bit here, so this is what I've written before. There's a few things actually I can change here. Firstly, the index, we don't need to do this anymore because the index need to do this anymore. Because the index, the logic that gets the correct model or gets all the information for this view is in the build to do table. We don't need to repeat it in the index. So let's just make sure this still works. Excuse me. So yeah, it still works. Because it's the Ajax that's calling the other function to build that data. We don't need to do that twice. So that was the first thing. The second thing is that we've got a lot of code here in build to do table, which isn't really to do with building the to do table, which is getting the list of to dos, which is for the user that's currently in the web application. So I think that's something we're going to end up needing to use in some other functions. So I'm going to make that its own thing. So I'm going to have a private, and it's going to return an IEnumerable of to do. So a list of to dos. And I'm going to call it get my to dos. And it's going to be pretty simple. I'm going to just copy what we are doing down here. Copy what we are doing. Down here, because I'm not going to need that in there. So this, because I'm not going to need that in there. So this, and then I'm going to this, and then I'm going to return this, and then I'm going to return that. So I've just copied the code. It's now returning this rather than we're working out each time, and then I can basically change this down here. In fact, I can make this really simple now. This is just one line, get my to-dos. So there we go. So that means if I need to make another view, probably the edit view maybe, I can just, instead of keep repeating this code, I can just write this function. And let's check that that works. Let's go to my to-do list. And yeah, there it goes. It's working. So that's fine. So the thing we need to do is again, I keep coming back to this, we need to recreate this, where I type, there's a form box on the page, I type something in, push enter, and it adds that to the server and updates the my to-do list on the page. So how are we going to do that? Let's go to the to-do, to the index. The way we're going to do it is we're going to do it with an Ajax form using Ajax helpers. So this is our index. The table div is here, and that's going to be we're not going to need to say create, and do you know what, we're not going to do I want to change this? I'm not going to put that. We need to say create, and do you know what, we're not going to do I want to change this? I'm not going to put that there. We don't want that. So I'm going to make a new div. I'm going to call ID equals, let's call it to do create form. ID for CSS selectors is, it should be unique. There's only, so like you can't have two elements with the same ID. Or if you do, I don't know actually what would happen if you did that, but the idea is that an ID is how you get a specific element. So with this, we use the ID table div because we know that that's the only element on this page that's called table div, so we're going to be putting it in the right place. Now I'm going to use the Ajax helper to make this form. Now, do I make the form? And then we're going to create our form in here. So the first argument is going to be the name of this works kind of like an action link. So we looked at HTML helpers where we built action links before, where we pass it a controller name and a controller action. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to make an Ajax create method. In our to-dos controller. So this Ajax form is going to, with the result, call this function. And then the next one is our Ajax options. So we'll come down here and we're going to do, let's bring that in here, new Ajax options. Actually, let's start again. Never very good at this kind of tabbing and stuff. So we want new Ajax options. Is that not working? Right, okay. Okay, now we've got our Ajax options. So we're going to come down here, new Ajax. I don't know why IntelliSense isn't doing this. It can sometimes be a bit finicky. Probably my fault because I was messing around with it. Tabbing. But what we want is we want insertion mode. So insertion mode is how is the Ajax going, what's the Ajax going to do with the result? And in this case, we want it to replace. We want it to replace the contents. Well, what we're doing, we're going to call this, we're going to write a control action. In fact, I'm wondering if it makes more sense to do the control action first. I'm going to do the control action first. Sorry about that. It makes more sense to do the control action first. into a new to-do item. Text box, and we're going to type in description, push enter, and it's going to submit that string into a new to-do item. And then it's going to call this function to rebuild the table in the div above it. Okay, so let's do our create. We're going to want to create. We're going to basically copy this method, very similar to this method, except it's going to be done on an Ajax call. So I'm actually going to start off by copying it, and then we'll figure out how to change it. So start off by copying it. And then we'll figure out how to change it. So we're going to call this Ajax create. So when a request is made, and HTTP request is made using a form, the data is going to be submitted via post. We've said HTTP post here. And there's something called a model binding system in .NET that takes all the information from that post request, and it tries to match that up with the model that you're expecting. So in this, we've said we're expecting a to-do type. So it's going to look for, in this post, in all the post data, and look for things that have got ID, description, or is done. Now, if we didn't put this thing here called bind include, it would look for anything and try and insert anything it found. And what someone could do is someone could actually create their own post request and add in a user ID. And if they happen to somehow find a way of doing it, they could maybe put a to-do list in for someone else, because the binder wouldn't know that unless we told it, look, you should only expect the ID, description, and if it's done or not. So that's what this is here for, here. Now, we don't actually want to take in an is done at this stage, because we're creating a new to-do list item. We know it isn't done, so we can take that out. So most of this is going to be the same. I'm going to set the to-do dot is done to false, because we've just created it. Save changes. We're not going to redirect, because with this one, remember how this one worked? We went to the create page, then we created it, and then we got redirected back to the index. We don't need to do that. We're going to stay in the same view, but we're going to return a partial view. Remember how this one worked? We went to the create page, then we created it, and then we got redirected back to the index. We don't need to do that. We're going to stay in the same view. but we're going to return a partial view. And it's going to be the same as when we had this here. Okay. Ajax create. So there we go. So we are going. So what's happening is with our Ajax form, we're going to do a HTTP post request. The binding system is going to look at that information and it's going to see that there's ID and a description. It's going to create a to-do object. If that model is valid, it's going to add the user information. Set is done to false, add it to the database, save the changes, and then it's going to return a partial view of the user's to-dos using the getMyToDos function. Yeah, so remember we made this, that's a list of to-dos. So that's the function we want our Ajax request to call, or that's what the action we want it to take. The result, this partial view, we then want that to be put into the table div that we made last time. So let's go back to, let's get rid of that index. Yeah. So we're going to go in here. We're going to say using and then Ajax begin form. Aha, right, okay, I realize what the problem is. Up here in this view, we've got our model defined as a list of to-dos. Now our form is only going to be creating one. So we need to change this to get rid of the enumerable and just have to do. So the Ajax form is only going to create the one thing. That might actually not have been what was causing the error, but we're going to go with it. So our method is going to be Ajax create. And it's going to be in to-dos, the to-dos controller. And then we want a new Ajax options. And what we're going to add to this, we're going to have our insertion mode. Okay, there we go, it's better. Equals, so we're going to be it's insertion mode dot replace. So we're going to be replacing the contents of table div, which probably when we're entering this form, there's going to be already something in there because we've already ran this script build table. The contents is there, and we're going to want to add new items. So we're replacing what's in there. We're going to want a HTTP method and tell it to use post. And then we want the update target ID is equal to, this is going to be our div, which is table div. Right. Okay, so that is we've begun the form. So that's all the information that the form needs. Now we want to actually, well, that's the information the helper needs. Now we actually want to build the form itself. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the views to do create. Now we did this scaffolding, so let's use it. Right, we just want to do the all we want to do is the description. So that's here. So you can see model.description. So let's put this in here. So you can see model.description. So let's put this in here. Right, is that working? So, oh, we need to, there we go. So what we've got here now is we've got, well, the other thing we're missing is an anti-forgery token. So what this does is this sends basically a session ID along with the post information, which is validated here. This means if someone like steals your cookie or something like that, they can't keep using, they can't keep creating to-dos for you because it's going to expect a session ID that only lasts, within a session. So it's a security feature. The other thing I'm going to enable is I'm going to load the validations, the client-side validation scripts.render, and then it is bundles. I just know what this is. .jQuery val. So what that is that's going to load all the scripts you need for validation with jQuery. And that means it's just a text box at the moment. We haven't got any real validation for it. But if we wanted to set like a maximum string length or a minimum string length, then it would check on the client side, it wouldn't check by doing the request and then getting a response back, which I think for an Ajax table, like if you're doing Ajax forms, that's what you really should be doing. I think client-side validation is important anyway for like a much quicker experience. You're told straight away, yeah, this is wrong, before it gets sent to the server. So this is what we expect to happen. Let's go through this again before we try it and make sure I haven't forgotten anything. So a user is going to browse to the to-do, so just /todos, right? So just to this URL /todos. The routing system is going to instantiate a todos controller class, which has a reference to our data context, our database, and it's going to call this function index, which returns the view. And because we haven't specified a specific view, it's going to look for the one that's the same name in the to-dos folder, which is index. This will all load, and there'll be an empty table div. Because we've added this script here, it's going to call the build table script. That's going to make an Ajax request to to-dos build to-do table. The routing system is going to figure out that means you want to call the function build to-do table in the to-dos controller, which is here. What that does is return a partial view, which is a view that doesn't have any layout associated with it. It's just HTML of my to-dos. So we wrote this function my to-dos here, which looks at the current user and then does a database query and finds all the to-dos for that user and returns them as a list of to-dos. Okay, and then this runs. This HTML is sent to this Ajax function on success, and then some and everything. Here we're using the Ajax helpers in the framework, and we've said begin form, we want it to call the Ajax create method in to-dos. We want it to replace the contents of that div. The div we want to replace is table div, and we want it to be a post request. We had to change the model in index to a single to-do because that's now what our model on this page is all about. We're only going to be accepting the description, and we've just used the standard helpers to build this for us. We don't need to have a button because when you push enter, that automatically submits the form. So the Ajax create method is here. We've specified that the only things we want the only parameters we want the binder to look for are the description and the ID. We don't want it to look for any user information. That's stuff that we don't want. That's to stop overposting attacks. And if you're not sure what that is, give it a Google. Overposting attacks. That we don't want it to look for any user information. That's stuff that we don't want. That's to stop overposting attacks. And if you're not sure what that is, give it a Google. That's going to take in the to-do object. It's going to associate the current user with that to-do. Its set is done to false. Add that to our database context, our database thing up here. There we go. And then it's going to save the database, and it's going to return a partial view. It's not going to change the view, and it's going to do the to-do date table, this partial view, with my to-dos, with the user's to-dos in it. Okay, so that's the theory. That's what should happen. So let's build it and go. So we've got our to-dos. We have a form. I might get rid of the label, actually. We'll see. So if I type Jack's entry. There we go. Look at that. So that's quick as well. Like another. Okay, it's adding it straight away. Now the question is this actually working? So let's, how do we check that? I'm going to go back to the home page. I'm going to go back to my to-do list, and they're all there. Yeah, so that's it. It's working. So this is, we have got this functionality. Okay, we've got that. That's what we wanted. So where do we say the page shouldn't refresh when a user adds a new item? Done. Okay, I think this is quite good. So there we go. Now we obviously there's things we want to change still. Like for starters, we can't click is done. What we're going to end up doing is actually doing it in a similar way to this. Right, this is actually, do you know what? Because this is bugging me. I'm going to go here, stop it. I don't want the label. don't want the label. Let's see how that looks. That's better. There's a bit of a, I don't know, I'd prefer if that lined up and there was less padding. I mean, we could do that, so I'm not going to get too worried about formatting in this set of tutorials, but just to show you how you would go about it. So, right. This is how I do it anyway, is that you can click on this element. So we've got this element here, and it tells you things like padding and where it got this styling from. So I'm not sure. You'd have to dig into it. Maybe it'd be this one. Maybe this one's controlling that. Yeah, see, so this is really good. Like, I think this is chain, like, I don't know. Maybe if you're like an trivial, but if you're starting to learn like CSS and all this stuff, these tools are incredible because I've clicked on that div and I can mouse over here. So firstly, this is telling me everywhere where it got, how this got styled the way it is, because CSS is a cascading style sheet, or what's it? Is that the right? Let's check this. Yeah, cascading style sheet, which means that you can keep adding rules to the same element and it cascades, which is really good for someone who has like accessibility problems. Maybe you have someone who has bad eyesight who needs to say, look, I need you to make all font, every element, you make the font size like whatever, like 20, minimum or something. And that's why it's useful. But it can get a bit complicated, and you've got all these things like position, margin, border. But look, I've selected this element and I've got here, I can mouse over and it's showing me on the screen that green is where the paddings come from. Okay, so I could make a rule to get rid of that padding. I could change this, instead of using this class here, I could use a different class. In fact, probably the simplest way is to not use a class at all. So let's get rid of this class. See how this works. This might not work. Just saying. But it did. Right, so there you go. Okay, we could tell that that's what that padding, which we didn't want, was coming from that class. So by just getting rid of that, we now have it. It's lined up. I mean, I quite like that. So yeah, so I kind of lost. That was a tangent. So where are we? We can add items like really easily to this. What we can't do is we can't click is done. And so what we'll be doing is following the same kind of process as we did with this form, but we'll be turning these into individual, not so much forms, but there'll be selectors, and we can set events listeners on them using jQuery, and those then will fire off AJAX requests to do the stuff we want. I really hope this was useful and has started to make things come together. Now, I said in like my introduction video that one of the difficult things about teaching this stuff is that it's really hard to pick a direction to start at. And perhaps, like, if you've come to this video tutorial set like with not very much knowledge, you're probably finding it quite difficult because of that. But I'm hoping if you've got a little bit of knowledge, if you're in my course, maybe we're halfway through the term and you're thinking about sitting down and start your project, that this will be helpful. That this will start triggering neurons and paths in your brain to figure this stuff out. Anyway, I completely lost what I was talking about because I got excited about the CSS. So yeah, so next time we're going to be adding the ability to check if this is done. But I think this is coming on quite nicely. As always, any questions, then ask me. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Sean Moulton, SEAN. Yeah, questions, comments, all great. So thanks for listening. Okay, so last time we implemented some Ajax, which meant that when we create a new to-do, it didn't refresh the page, it just updated the table. So just to show you this again, if I add another to-do here, let's call it 3. I push enter and that fires an Ajax request which inserts this new to-do into our database and just updates this area. Remember, we were trying to recreate the functionality of the Trello to-do list. Previously, to add a new to-do, we had to go to a different page, a create page, type in all the details, click create, and then it redirected us back to this page. So this is what we've got now. Let's have a look on our list of targets and see what we've got left to do. So we've got users should only be able to edit their own to-do items. Users should be able to mark items as complete. Styles should change, and there should be a percentage completed indicator. So what we're going to work on today is this one here. Users should be able to mark items as complete. At the moment, if I wanted to set this one as complete, I'd have to click Edit, click Is Done here, and click Save, and then that would take, that's done it. These here aren't actually like selectors. I can't click on these, and they're not interactable. I think that's how you say it. What we want is this kind of functionality where I click on the list, I click on the checkbox, and it updates the server. There's some Ajax going on that updates this table. Much like how I can just add new items with this text box. So let's get started. Let's stop this running. Now the way we're going to do this is we're change these into actual interactable selectors, and we're going to add event listeners to them that are going to listen for when we change the value. And when we change the value, that's going to fire off events, an Ajax call that basically works the same way as this text box. But we're not going to be creating a new item, we're just going to be editing an existing one. So as always, it's difficult to figure out where to start. I think the easiest place to start probably is going to be by first changing these from displays to actually interactable items. So if I go to the to-do table here, and this is what builds, this is our partial view that builds the table that we see in there. And we can see we've got display for model item is done. This is the one we want to change. I'm going to change this to checkbox 4. And that will, so now what will happen if I run it again? My to-do list. Right, now we have checkboxes. But these checkboxes, they don't do anything. They're just checking. They don't do, yeah, that's all they do. There's no functionality. I can uncheck this. It doesn't actually change the value for this to do. So we need to add that using some jQuery. And right, I think what we're going to do is, like we did last time, I'm going to build the controller function first. So the jQuery is going to fire an Ajax request. So remember we made this Ajax stuff here, which sent, this is what happens when we want to build the table the first time that the document loads. So on the document load, it sends a request to this URL, and then that URL returns the partial view of this table, and it puts it in table div, which is in our index, which is here. I'm going to put a space there to make it a bit clearer. So it puts it in this table div. So we want to do the same kind of thing. So the first thing we need is a controller action to actually perform the logic. So let's go to our to-dos controller. Now the thing we're going to be changing is, or the thing we're going to be using, this is basically going to be an edit. So I'm going to look at the edit method that's already here. So this is the edit method that is used by, we go to that, the one I showed at the start, where we go to another page. And so it's expecting you to give it a to-do. It changes that particular to-do in the database if needed, and then saves the changes and redirects to the index. So let's do this. In this case, we're not using a form, so I can't, or it'd be too complicated to sort out the validation for the anti-forgery token. So I'm gonna, well, too complicated for this tutorial. There are ways you could do it manually, but that's a bit beyond us at the moment. So we're going to call this, I'm going to call it Ajax capitals because that's what we called the Ajax create. So it's going to be Ajax edit. I'm going to change, we're not actually going to be using the model binding in this case. Because again, we're not using a form. What I'm going to be doing is sending, what I want to do, the way I'm thinking is going to be best, is that we have, so the user could click on, I could click on this one, this checkbox. But at the moment, all these checkboxes are the same element. They're not, if I look at this, view tools, developer tools, let's find them. It's going to be in here, in the table, here. Let's pick this one. So, yeah, so here you can see this is the actual R checkbox. Now there's nothing to tell us that there's any difference. This checkbox and this checkbox are the same. There's no way of knowing that this checkbox is associated with this particular to-do. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some parameters to the attributes in here. So I'm going to change this attribute where it says ID. In fact, let's do that now. It's probably going to be clearer if we do that now. So what? I'll leave this as it is. So we're going to go to the to-do table. So we're creating this checkbox here. Now, all helpers, you can add another argument, which is the HTML parameters or attributes. Sorry, the HTML attributes that this thing that the helper is creating going to have. And so what we're going to do is, much like here, we're going to do ID equals item.id. So when it makes this checkbox, it's going to give it the ID that this has. And remember, the ID is the primary key. But I'm also, actually no, that's all I'm going to do for now. Yeah, that's all we need for right now. Oh, excuse me. So in this function, we're going to, the first argument is we're going to take the ID. So very similar to up there. First argument is we're going to take the ID. So very similar to up there. This is how the function is going to know which to do you're changing. And then we also need to give it a value, which. So very similar to up there. This is how the function is going to know which to do you're changing. And then we also need to give it a value. And this is going to be the value that we want to set our is done to. So we're going to start out. We probably should have gone from this one actually. I'm going to copy this code here. Yeah. Because this is basically what we're doing. So I'm going to copy that code there, and I'm going to replace it in here. Right, so we pass this controller action. It's squiggly line because we're not returning a view yet, which is fine. So we'll do that in a minute. So we've got the Ajax edit, and that's taking two arguments: the ID of the to-do item that we're changing, and the value we want is done change to. And then what this code does is it has a look. Firstly, if you don't provide it with an ID, it returns a bad request error. Then it tries to find the to-do that's with the ID that we gave it. If it doesn't find one, it returns a HTTP not found, else we want to do something. So else we want to set to do, which is the one we got from the database here. Remember, DB is our database context, which is a private field parameter here. So DB is our application DB context. So we want to set to do dot is done equals value. Okay, because we might be changing it from done to not done, right? That's valid. Then we want to kind of do this again, right? So we're then doing this. Where we have a look, and what this does is this modifies the entry. So it puts this entry in, it looks at to do, it modifies it, and then it saves the changes. Okay, that's what these lines do here, which I took from this edit action that was put in here by the scaffolding. And then we want to, whatever happens, we still want the table. Well, we don't actually need to update the table unless it works. So return partial. Well, no, we've got to. Sorry. So we're going to return partial view, and then we're going to do it the same way that we've done it. Partial view, and then we're going to do it the same way that we've done it in these other Ajax. When the Ajax create, is we're going to be returning just the table. So let's go through what's happening. So we're going to click one of these. What I want to happen is this. When I click this, I want an event to be fired that calls this controller action. And this controller action is going to, the event, when the event fires, I'm going to have somehow figured out what the ID of this to do is. And that's going to be passed to this action along with the value that I set it to. So because I clicked like that, the value will now be true. So it's going to take that value true. We've got a couple of error check steps here. It's very unlikely that there'll be an error because the table is, you can only get to this unless, the only way you would get an error from this probably, you know, 'cause you never know, is if you try to navigate to this URL on your own and just put in random numbers, because the ID will have come from our actual table. So if this doesn't, if we end up here or here, then there's a bug in our code, basically. I mean, what you should be doing is you should be returning a better, you could return a partial view that has some kind of error message in it. A meaningful error message would be a better way, perhaps. But for now, this is fine. So we check to see if the ID is even there. If it is, we find the to-do with that ID. If it's null, that means we didn't find it. We return a HTTP not found. Otherwise, well, in fact, this is returning it, so it will end up in that, well, probably we want to do like that. No. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so this will work. In fact, yeah. So in the case that it's broken, you're going to get, it'll redirect to a HTTP not found or whatever. Whereas here, assuming that everything went well, we correctly picked a to-do and found it in our database, then we set the value of is done to the value that was input to this action. We update the database, save it, and then return the partial view, which is this table here. And then that'll go back to the JavaScript, the jQuery, and the Ajax, and it will replace table div with the new updated table with everything saved and nice. Okay, hopefully, now I've said that a few times, you're kind of following. When it's all working, I'm sure you'll see what's going on. So what we're going to need is we're going to need another JavaScript script. So let's add, I right click to get this menu up, by the way, JavaScript file, and let's call it add check box listeners. Hopefully that's spelled right. Listener, yep. Okay, so we've got add check. Listener, add checkbox listener. I'm going to put that up there. Now, we're going to be doing this using jQuery. So first we need to check the document's loaded. It should, like, the way that when this, no, well, it might not. So we should always do this, right? You always start any jQuery with this, because if the document isn't loaded, it's not going to be able to add, it won't find the elements that you want, and it won't be able to add these events to them. Now, to be able to add an event listener to an element, we need to be able to identify that element, and that's something we haven't done yet. If we go here, so, and the way you identify things would be by the HTML attributes. So what we can do is we can actually give all of these boxes a class, which is a CSS selector class. I'm going to say class CSS selector class. So I'm going to say class equals, and I'm going to call it active check. Okay, and that way it's only these checkboxes that are created here that will have this. Maybe there's somewhere else we want a checkbox and we don't want the this function to be, this event listener put on there. So let's do $. The first thing you do in any jQuery, the first argument here is basically a way of searching for all the elements you want. So in this case, I want find the ID from the HTML attribute that we set here, find the value from just the property of the element because it's a checkbox, and then once it's got those, it's going to do an AJAX request to this URL. It's going to do a post, HTTP post. That's going to call this function AJAX edit. Remember, the routing system is going to look at this URL and convert that into a controller and action, and it's going to call this method. Now, these data, the arguments come from the data that we sent with this request, which are named paired values, right? So ID, ID, value, value, which we got from here. They'll go in there. This will then run, and it will update the database with how we've changed the value of to do, and then return a partial view, which, remember, a partial view is just HTML. It's just going to look at this. It's not going to apply any kind of layout. It's just going to create this table, and it's going to return that to the AJAX call, and it'll end up as this thing result. And on success, this AJAX function, once this is all done, it's going to change the HTML of table div, which is in our index, remember here, and set that to result. Okay? That's what should happen. And hopefully, oh, okay, I almost forgot something. This script currently isn't being run anywhere. So nothing would, this is just not ever going to happen. Now I'm going to put a reference to this script in the table itself, and I'll tell you why in a minute. It's a script source, and it's in custom scripts. There we go. Now I'm adding this script to the table, the partial view, because I want these event listeners to be added anytime we create this table. If I put this script in the index file with all my others, then this would only be run the first time the page loads. Each time any kind of AJAX happens and the table is updated, it would be new elements, and those elements wouldn't have the event listeners attached to them. So we need to run this every time the table's updated, which is why we put it in this partial view. So hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully this works. So let's run. It seems to have built. That's a good sign. So what I'm actually going to do with this is I'm going to open the console and watch that to see if anything. Let's go to the console. I don't know what that is. That means right. So if I click that, I didn't get any error here, so that's a good thing. So okay, AJAX entry. I've set to is done. So if I go back to application, my to-do list, it's set as is done still. That's good. So if I set it, let's turn them all off. So I've unset them. Now I'm going to add another to-do, and that's going to refresh the table. So if our stuff works, that shouldn't change, which it isn't, which is good. So what happens if I click all these and add 5? Okay, it seems to be, it's working, right? Cool. So that works. But you can see, obviously, this is a much better, like, for the user than the original, what we had to do originally, which was click, like, edit, you know, click on this and go back to the list. And that's showing you, like, the scaffolding that the entity framework will do for you is really good. But it's very basic, and you need to change that. Now, if you're actually someone on my course, like, I'm really going to expect you to change this stuff and to think about the things I've done so far in this video tutorial and how you might be able to use those kind of ideas. So, right, card on. So, can we click? Is my connection off or something? No. So, users should be able to mark items complete. Right, that one's done. Page shouldn't refresh. That one's done. Users should only be able to edit their own to-do items. Now, way that a user can. So what we need to do. I'm trying to think the best way to do this. We're still going to want. Do we want? Here's the question: do we want users to be able to edit the text here? I think probably we do. Oh, it's not working because I've turned this off. It's missing something. Right. Is there? There we go. That's better. Is there one here? Right. Okay. Can a user edit someone else's to-dos? That's the question. Because what I was thinking, you don't know what I was thinking, so you don't know what on earth I'm going on about, is that we could just get rid of these edit methods and not allow a user to edit things through there. But if they do want to edit the text, maybe we do want to let them do this. What we could do is we could check. We could add a check here if we wanted to, right? We could add a check to see if. Well, let's do that. We only need to do it in this first edit. So notice how we have two edit methods. So basically, this first edit method is what gets fired. I'll show you. My to-do list. So when I click edit, if you look at the URL down in the bottom corner, right? I don't have two mouse pointers. So you can see it says the URL it's going to is to-dos edit 8. So I click that, and it does it. It's firing this version of the action. This is an overloaded version, which runs when there's a post request when I click save. So if we can add a check here to see if the current user is the current user. And we'll do that. That shouldn't be too hard. So, string current user. Let's get the current user. Edit. Right, so we need to get to the point where we need to actually, so I'm going to do it here. We need to see firstly, have we even got a to-do? So if we've got a to-do, we get the current user, and, well, actually, no, we first want to see if it's null. So the first thing we do is, does it exist in the first place? Now, if it does exist, we're going to check if to-do.user not, well, actually what we're going to do is we're going to do dot ID. How do we do this? Let's do user not equal current user. Then we're going to return a bad request. Okay, we'll see if this works. I'm not sure if we can check. I'm not sure if we can check equality like this with the users. We'll see. My to-do list, edit. Okay, that's worked. So now if I copy this URL, log off, and paste it. There we go. We've got a bad request. Because in that case, I'm not the current user because I'd logged out. So it didn't let me, the form didn't